All right, welcome guys. Hope you guys are enjoying the long weekend with Monday and Tuesday off. We're going to move on here and talk about aggregate supply. We've been covering aggregate demand in class. So the next piece of the puzzle that we need to look at is aggregate supply. But before we do that, I just want to review in your homework here what shifts the aggregate demand curve. There are a couple key distinctions that we want to draw with aggregate supply, so this will be a good chance for a review. So go ahead and answer the questions in your homework. You can go ahead and hit pause here on the video. I'll get up and leave so it's not weird like I'm staring at you from the bottom of the screen again. So take a second, answer the question, tell me what happens in each scenario, right? If Congress cuts taxes, what does that do to aggregate demand? So go ahead and answer those in your homework here as a good chance for a review. And then when we come back, we'll take a look at aggregate supply. All right, so hopefully that was some good review for you guys. You were able to take a look at what happens with aggregate demand. So we can move on here and take a look at aggregate supply. Now, aggregate supply is the relationship between the price level and real GDP supplied. Notice this is different than aggregate demand. When we were looking at aggregate demand, we were looking at price level and real GDP demanded by consumers, by households, firms, businesses, the government, the rest of the world. So here we're looking at it from the producer's point of view, the supplier's point of view. Now notice there are two aggregate supply curves that you guys need to be familiar with. The upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, the SRAS, and the vertical long run aggregate supply, LRAS. We'll go over long run aggregate supply in class this week. I just want to focus today though just on the short run aggregate supply curve. So notice our short run aggregate supply curve has an upward slope to it. All right, and we need to know kind of the reason behind it. And part of it is intuitive. Part of it we would realize, right, that as price level rises, meaning as producers can charge more for their goods or services, they'll produce more output, right? Real GDP supplied. Now, right, because we know that the higher the price that they can charge, the more profit that they stand to make. And so that gives us sort of the big picture overview of why the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, but we need to look at it a little more detailed and see why exactly that is. And so each producer must ask the same basic question. All right, is it profitable for me to do what I'm doing? Is it profitable for me to make an extra unit of output? Is it producing that unit of output going to make me a profit or not? All right, and profit per unit of output, to get that, you simply take the price. What does it cost to sell, or what is the consumer paying for that, minus the production cost. And so if you're making a profit, right, if you're making a profit, you'll continue to sell it. So if the price of that unit of output is rising faster than the cost of producing that unit, right, that unit will be produced. And so this is exactly what's happening in the short run. And so this is what gives us our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. So let's take a look at why that is. To explain this, we need to know a little bit about input prices, right? Input prices are all the costs that go into making a good or service. And some of them are what we call sticky. This means that they take a long time to respond. They kind of stick in one place and it takes a while for them to catch up. They don't rise or fall very quickly in response to a change in demand for them. All right, and this allows firms to earn more profit per unit because the price goes up, but the input costs don't keep pace in a sense. They rise slower. And so let's look at labor, right? Labor is a really good example of a sticky input price. All right, so let's take a look at two scenarios and see how this is. All right, in scenario one, we have a strong economy. All right, demand for products is strong. Producers are selling their output like it's going out of style, and they're raising prices. Prices are slightly increasing, and profit per unit is skyrocketing. Now, to keep pace with this increased demand for their product, for their good, for their service, they'll need to hire more workers. All right, and so this is going to increase demand for workers, shift the demand curve for workers outward. All right, but wages don't keep pace with that. All right, employers are reluctant to immediately raise nominal wages. All right, and some employees have already signed contracts agreeing to a specific wage, and so those wages are fixed. Now, that's going to keep wages stagnant. Even though price is skyrocketing, profit is skyrocketing, wages are slow to respond to this. Now, eventually, right, as workers compete for these jobs and things like that, we'll see more rise in wages as firms are forced to pay more for better workers. But the bottom line is that the price of output rose quickly with stronger demand, right? People are buying more of this good or service, but the price of labor, this input price, rose much more slowly. So labor is a very good example of what we call a sticky wage. Now, we can look at it from another point of view as well. In a weak economy, right, maybe sort of similar to what we're experiencing now, let's say that demand for products is weak, we're in a recession perhaps, and producers are selling fewer units. All right, their goods and services aren't selling as well. So prices have to come down as well. Profit per unit is crashing. Now, eventually they will need to reduce their employment, right? They'll begin to lay off workers, they will begin to fire workers, things like that. And so the demand for labor shifts inwards. But they need to hold on to some workers. So employers aren't going to immediately start lowering wages, all right, because they know that they'll lose more employees. So, and some employees have signed contracts, again, that fixes their wages for that period of time, all right? Now, eventually the labor market will get so weak, unemployment is so high that people will begin to take jobs for lower pay, nominal wages will begin to fall. But notice, again, this took up time to catch up. So even though the price of output, the price of goods and services fell quickly when demand started to weaken, the labor prices took a while to respond. And so those input prices for producing a good or service are sometimes called sticky, and labor is a really good example of that. All right. Now, we can also talk about shifts of the short run aggregate supply curve. All right, here we're looking at anything that makes up supply. When we fundamentally change what makes up supply, we shift the short run aggregate supply curve. All right, for example, commodity prices. A commodity is any standardized input that goes into making products. All right, so for example, steel. Steel is an input in manufacturing airplanes, for example. Now, if steel becomes more expensive, all right, the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. So anytime we raise production prices on these commodities, all right, this is an input for many final products. So higher commodity prices makes it more costly for these firms to produce. And so we'll shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the left. So if commodity prices increase, the curve shifts to the left. Now, if commodity prices decrease, it becomes cheaper to produce. We'll shift it to the right, and we can see that there. All right, similar thing happens with nominal wages. Again, very important input in production is labor, and the current price of labor is the nominal wages. Now, if wages increase, it's the same thing that we saw with commodity prices, right? It's going to shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the left. Anytime we make it more expensive to produce a good or a service, the curve will shift to the left. Okay. Now, if wages fall, like they are now, right, it becomes relatively cheaper to produce, the short run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. But, right, if we talk about increasing production costs, it's always going to shift to the left. All right, similar thing happens with productivity. All right, suppose workers at a factory are provided with better tools, better equipment, better training, and so they can better increase their output. Okay, they become more productive. We get more efficient in a sense. All right, if this is happening across the economy, right? So remember, we're looking at macroeconomics, so this is an economy-wide production. If this happens, if workers become more productive, all right, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. All right, as workers become more productive, the same amount of labor can produce more goods and services, right? That's the key here, that we can produce more for basically the same cost. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. All right, so I hope that this gives you a little bit of an understanding of the short-run aggregate supply curve. When you come in on Wednesday and Thursday, please have the homework answered, all right, and we will go over that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the long-run aggregate supply curve. So I'll see you guys in class this week.